The morning sun cast long shadows across Atlanta's bustling financial district as Joseph Williams adjusted his tie in his car's rearview mirror. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1992, and the air held that particular southern mix of warmth and morning chill. He'd chosen his charcoal gray suit carefully that morning, the one his wife had helped him pick out from that fancy department store downtown. "You look like success," she told him, smoothing down the lapels. As a successful real estate developer, Joseph had grown used to dressing the part. His polished shoes clicked against the sidewalk as he made his way towards Southview Bank's impressive glass and stone building. The portfolio tucked under his arm contained detailed plans for his latest project, a mixed-use development that would bring affordable housing and new businesses to a struggling neighborhood on the city's east side. Through the revolving doors, the bank's lobby stretched out before him, all marble floors and high ceilings. The security guard's eyes followed him as he walked in, but Joseph was used to that too. 15 years in business had taught him that success didn't shield you from certain realities. He'd learned to let those looks roll off his back like morning dew. The clicking of keyboards and murmur of conversations filled the air as he approached the information desk. The young woman behind it was speaking with an elderly white couple, helping them find the right department for their needs. Joseph stood patiently, taking in the framed photos on the wall showcasing the bank's history, all featuring faces that looked nothing like his own. When it was his turn, he stepped forward with a warm smile. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the gentle confidence that had helped him close million-dollar deals. "I'd like to speak with someone about a business loan, please." The receptionist looked up, then quickly looked down at her computer screen. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, her voice suddenly formal and cold. "No, ma'am," Joseph replied, maintaining his professional demeanor. "But I'd be happy to wait for the next available loan officer." "I understand if there might be a short wait." She made a show of checking something on her computer, though Joseph noticed her mouse hadn't moved. "I'm afraid all our loan officers are fully booked today. Perhaps you could try one of the community banks in your own neighborhood." Joseph had heard that suggestion before, the polite way of saying go somewhere else. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out his business card. "I understand they're busy, but my project has a rather tight timeline. I'm Joseph Williams of Williams Development Group. We've completed several major projects in the metro area, and I'd be happy to." "Sir," she cut him off, not even glancing at the card. "As I said, we're fully booked. And we typically work with established businesses." The emphasis on established made his jaw tighten, but years of experience had taught him to keep his composure. "Ma'am, my company has been in business for 15 years. We have an excellent credit rating and—" "Is there a problem here?" A man in an expensive suit had approached, his badge identifying him as Thomas Richardson, branch manager. But instead of addressing Joseph, he spoke directly to the receptionist. "This gentleman is insisting on seeing a loan officer without an appointment," she explained, emphasizing gentleman in a way that suggested she meant anything but. Richardson turned to Joseph, looking at him as if he were something unpleasant that had blown in through the door. "Sir, this is a private financial institution. We reserve the right to choose our clients, and I'm afraid we won't be able to help you today." He gestured toward the security guard, who was already moving in their direction. Joseph stood his ground, maintaining his dignity. "Mr. Richardson, I'm simply requesting information about a business loan. My company has a strong track record and—" "I've made myself clear," Richardson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "We don't serve your kind here. Jerry," he called to the security guard, "please escort this person out." The guard approached, hand resting meaningfully on his belt. Other customers were starting to stare, some with embarrassment, others with that familiar mix of curiosity and discomfort. Joseph could have argued, could have pulled out his phone and started recording, could have made a scene that would have ended up on the evening news. Instead, he slowly placed his business card back in his pocket, straightened his tie, and looked Richardson directly in the eye. "Thank you for your time," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I'll remember this conversation." The guard didn't need to escort him out. Joseph walked out on his own, head held high, his expensive shoes clicking against that marble floor one last time. Outside, the autumn sun was still shining, but something had shifted in the air. As he stood on the sidewalk, watching the city bustle around him, a plan began to form in his mind. Back in his car, Joseph didn't immediately start the engine. Instead, he sat there, hands resting on the steering wheel, and thought about his father. The man had worked 2 jobs his entire life, saving every penny he could, teaching Joseph that success wasn't just about making money, it was about creating change. When they closed one door, his father used to say, "Don't waste time knocking. Build your own house." Joseph pulled out his phone and dialed his wife's number. When she answered, he could hear the concern in her voice. She knew he'd had the bank meeting today. "How did it go?" she asked. He looked up at the bank's imposing building, its windows gleaming in the sunlight. "They kicked me out," he said simply. "Oh, honey," she started to express sympathy, but he cut her off gently. "But it's okay," he said, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth, "because I just figured out our next big project." "What do you mean?" Joseph watched as Richardson, the bank manager, walked out of the building for his lunch break, not even glancing in the direction of Joseph's parked car. "Remember how you always say every closed door is an opportunity?" He started his car, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Well, this isn't going to be about getting through that door anymore. We're going to own the whole building." As he pulled away from the curb, Joseph's mind was already working through the numbers, the possibilities, the strategies. They'd tried to humiliate him, to make him feel small and powerless. Instead, they'd given him a mission. The security guard, the receptionist, that smug manager, none of them realized that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Joseph didn't tell anyone what happened at the bank that day, not his business partners, not his friends, not even his parents. Only his wife knew, and she watched with quiet understanding as he spent that evening in his home office, surrounded by papers and his old laptop's glowing screen. "You're not angry?" she asked, bringing him a cup of his favorite tea, the kind they discovered on their anniversary trip to Charleston. He looked up from his work, the lamplight catching the silver starting to show at his temples. "Being angry doesn't solve problems," he said, taking a sip. "My daddy always said that anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." She sat on the edge of his desk, something she'd done countless times during their 15 years of marriage. "So what are you doing?" Joseph turned his laptop so she could see the screen. It showed Southview Bank's public financial records, their stock performance over the last 5 years, news articles about their business practices. "I'm learning," he said simply. And learn he did. Over the next few weeks, Joseph dove deep into research, staying up late after finishing his regular work at the development company. He discovered that Southview Bank, despite its impressive building and air of success, was struggling. Their stock had dropped 15% in the past year. They'd made risky loans to big developers while rejecting smaller, more stable businesses. Their reputation in the community was slipping. But the most interesting thing he found came from an unexpected source. His barber, Ray, who'd been cutting hair in the same shop for 30 years, mentioned that several other business owners had similar experiences at Southview. "You're not the first they've turned away," Ray said one Saturday morning, the familiar snip of scissors punctuating his words. "Remember Mr. Chen from the grocery store? Tried to get a loan to expand last year. Had perfect credit too. They didn't even look at his paperwork." That conversation sparked an idea. Joseph started reaching out to other business owners, not just black entrepreneurs, but anyone who'd faced discrimination from traditional banks. He met them for coffee, for lunch, sometimes just quick conversations in parking lots between meetings. Each story was different, but the pattern was the same. One evening, he invited a small group to his house. They gathered in his living room, store owners, contractors, restaurateurs. His wife served her famous peach cobbler as they shared their experiences. "They told me my restaurant was too ethnic for a business loan," said Mrs. Park, who owned 3 successful Korean restaurants. "Even though I've been in business for 12 years. They wouldn't even let me open a business account," added Mr. Rodriguez, a construction contractor. "Said they needed extra verification. I've been in Atlanta longer than that bank manager's been alive." Joseph listened to each story, taking notes in his worn leather journal. When everyone had spoken, he stood up and walked to the whiteboard he brought in from his office. "What if," he said, uncapping a marker, "instead of fighting them, we bought them?" The room went quiet. Then someone laughed nervously. Buy the bank? Mr. Rodriguez asked. How would we even do that? Joseph turned to the whiteboard and started writing numbers. Southview's stock price has dropped 40% since its peak 3 years ago. They're vulnerable. Their lending practices have caught the attention of regulators. And here's the interesting part. Most of their shareholders are starting to sell. He explained his research, breaking down complex financial terms into simple language. The bank's weakness was an opportunity. If they pooled their resources, formed an investment group, they could start buying shares. Not all at once, but slowly, carefully. But that would take millions, Mrs. Park said, though Joseph noticed she was already pulling out her calculator. We have millions, Joseph replied. Between everyone in this room, we represent successful businesses with solid assets. We've all been denied by banks like Southview, so we've learned to succeed without them. Now we can use that success to create change. The discussion lasted late into the night. Some were skeptical, others excited. But by the time the last guest left, they had the beginnings of a plan. The next morning, Joseph called his old friend David, a financial analyst who could help him structure deals in the past. They met at a quiet coffee shop away from the financial district. It's ambitious, David said, reviewing the numbers. But it's not impossible. The bank's vulnerable, and their leadership is overconfident. They're so busy looking down on people, they don't notice what's happening to their own institution. Over the next few weeks, the plan took shape. They formed an investment group with a generic name that wouldn't raise suspicions. Each member contributed what they could, and Joseph reached out to silent partners who believed in their vision. But it wasn't just about money. Joseph knew they needed to understand every aspect of banking. He enrolled in online courses about banking regulations. He studied successful community banks in other cities. He even hired a discreet team of analysts to examine Southview's public records for any weaknesses they could leverage. His wife found him asleep at his desk more than once, face pressed against banking textbooks. "Are you sure about this?" she asked one night, gently shaking him awake. "It's a lot of risk." Joseph stretched and looked at the family photo on his desk. Him, his wife, their 2 kids who were now in college. "When our children were little," he said, "and someone pushed them down on the playground, what did we tell them?" "Get back up," she answered with a small smile. "And what else?" "Make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." He nodded. "That bank doesn't just push people down, it keeps them down. But we're not going to fight them. We're going to change them from the inside out." As autumn turned to winter, their investment group began making small stock purchases through different brokers. Nothing dramatic enough to raise alarms, just steady, quiet accumulation. Some shares came from retiring employees, others from institutional investors looking to diversify. Joseph kept a chart in his office, tracking their progress. Each tiny percentage of ownership represented another step toward their goal. His partners sometimes got impatient, wanting to move faster, but he reminded them of an old saying his grandmother loved: "A steady drop of water can wear away the hardest stone." One evening, as he was updating the chart, his phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Rodriguez. "Just heard Southview turned away another small business owner today. Made him wait 2 hours just to tell him no." Joseph looked at their progress. They now owned almost 12% of the bank's shares. He texted back, "Tell him to keep his business plan ready. Things are going to change." He turned back to his research, a small smile playing at his corners of his mouth. The bank's leadership still sat in their offices, looking down on people like him, not realizing that with each passing day, their power was slowly slipping away. The revolution wouldn't come with protests or angry confrontations. It would come through quiet persistence, smart strategy, and the power of overlooked people working together. And when it was done, those marble floors and high ceilings wouldn't be barriers anymore. They'd be assets in their mission to create real change. Spring came to Atlanta with its usual explosion of dogwood blossoms and pollen-filled air. Joseph's plan was growing just like the seasonal flowers, but much more quietly. His home office had transformed into what his wife jokingly called the war room, walls covered with charts, sticky notes, and financial projections. One morning, as he was reviewing the latest stock purchases over breakfast, his teenage son asked, "Dad, why don't you just tell everyone what the bank did? You could go on the news, make them look bad." Joseph put down his coffee cup and thought about how to explain it. "You remember when you were learning to play chess, he asked. His son nodded. What's the first thing I taught you? Don't just react to what's happening now. Think 3 moves ahead. Exactly, Joseph said, spreading some honey on his toast. Making them look bad might feel good for a minute, but it wouldn't change anything. We're not trying to shame them, we're trying to transform them. That transformation required more than just buying stock. Joseph knew they needed to build a complete foundation for what would come next. He spent the next few months creating a network of support that spread through Atlanta's business community like roots under a growing tree. His first stop was the Citizens Trust Bank, one of the oldest black-owned banks in America. He met with their board members, not asking for money, but for guidance. We need to understand how to run a bank the right way, he explained. One that serves everyone while still making a profit. The bank's president, an older gentleman who'd seen the civil rights movement firsthand, spent hours sharing his experience. Banking isn't just about money, he'd said, drawing diagrams on a legal pad. It's about trust, about believing in people's potential. Joseph took these lessons back to his investment group, which now met weekly in the back room of Mrs. Park's restaurant. The smell of Korean barbecue mixed with the sound of practical planning as they learned about banking regulations, community reinvestment requirements, and the importance of fair lending practices. They'd brought in experts, accountants, lawyers, former bank executives who helped them understand the complexities of what they were undertaking. Some offered their services at reduced rates, believing in the mission. Others joined their investment group, adding their resources to the growing pool. But the most important meetings happened in the community. Joseph and his partners spent weekends visiting churches, community centers, and small businesses. They didn't talk about their plan to buy the bank. Instead, they listened. They heard stories about dreams delayed and opportunities denied. About business plans gathering dust and homes lost to predatory loans. At one such meeting, held in the basement of an old church, an elderly woman stood up. Her hands were worn from decades of cleaning houses, but her voice was strong. I've been banking at Southview for 40 years, she said. Every month I deposit my money there. But when my granddaughter needed a loan for college, they turned her away. She had good grades and everything. Joseph wrote down her story, just like he'd written down hundreds of others. Each one was a brick in the foundation they were building. The investment group also focused on learning from mistakes others had made. They studied failed bank takeovers, successful community banks, and everything in between. Joseph's friend David, the financial analyst, created detailed models showing how they could maintain profitability while implementing more equitable lending practices. The numbers don't lie, David explained during one late-night session. Fair lending isn't just moral, it's good business. These communities have untapped potential. They just need someone to believe in them. As their knowledge grew, so did their resources. Word spread quietly through trusted networks about their investment group. A retired teacher invested her pension. A group of doctors pooled their resources. Small business owners contributed what they could. But it wasn't just about money. Each investor brought their own expertise and connections. Mr. Rodriguez knew every contractor in 3 counties. Mrs. Park had connections throughout the Asian business community. Each person added another thread to the tapestry they were weaving. Joseph made sure every investor understood this wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme. We're building something that will outlast all of us, he explained at each meeting. Something our grandchildren will be proud of. The work was exhausting. Joseph's wife often found him dozing in his office chair, spreadsheets scattered across his desk. She'd drape a blanket over his shoulders and leave a fresh cup of tea for when he woke up. One night, she asked him, "Do you ever regret starting this?" He looked up from his work, thinking about all the stories they'd heard, all the people counting on them. You know that feeling when you're exactly where you're supposed to be, doing exactly what you're supposed to do? He asked. That's how this feels. The summer was ending when they reached a crucial milestone. Their quiet stock purchases had given them ownership of nearly 30% of the bank. More importantly, they had built a network of support that stretched throughout the community. They had experts ready to step in, plans drawn up for new programs, and a clear vision for what the bank could become. One evening, as the investment group gathered for their weekly meeting, Joseph looked around the room. The faces around the table weren't just investors anymore. They were partners in a mission. Each person had sacrificed time, money, and energy because they believed in something bigger than themselves. "We're almost ready," he told them, standing at the head of the table. "But before we make our next move, I want everyone to remember why we're doing this. It's not about revenge. It's not even about money. It's about creating something that should have existed all along. A bank that sees people's potential, not just their past. A bank that lifts people up instead of pushing them down." As heads nodded around the table, Joseph pulled out his worn leather journal, the one where he'd written down every story, every dream, every hope people had shared with them. "These aren't just stories," he said, holding up the journal. "These are promises we're going to keep." The room fell quiet, every person feeling the weight of the moment. They weren't just building a foundation for a bank, they were building a foundation for change. And soon, very soon, they would be ready to take the next step. Fall painted Atlanta's trees in brilliant colors as Joseph's plan entered its most delicate phase. Like leaves falling quietly to the ground, the acquisition of Southview Bank needed to happen so gradually that no one would notice until it was too late. His wife found him in his office early one morning, before the sun had risen. He was on the phone with his broker, speaking in hushed tones despite being alone in the house. "Yes, just like we discussed. Small purchases, different times of day, no pattern they can trace." After hanging up, he noticed her standing in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. "You're up early," he said, accepting one of the cups gratefully. "Couldn't sleep," she replied, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Worried about my husband, who's trying to buy a bank without anyone knowing." He smiled, thinking about how far they'd come from that day when he'd been kicked out of Southview. "It's like Mama's old sweet potato pie recipe," he said. "You can't rush it. Has to be done just right, or the whole thing falls apart." Their investment group had grown beyond that first meeting in his living room. Now they operated through 5 different investment firms, each one handling a portion of their stock purchases. No single purchase was large enough to draw attention, but together they were slowly gathering power like a river gathering strength. David, his financial analyst friend, had set up a secure computer system to track their progress. Every morning, Joseph would check their total ownership percentage, watching it tick up by fractions. 32%, 33%, 34%. One afternoon, while getting his regular haircut at Ray's barbershop, Joseph overheard 2 bank employees talking without realizing who he was. "Management's getting nervous," one said. "Someone's been buying up stock, but nobody knows who." Ray caught Joseph's eye in the mirror and quickly changed the subject to last night's basketball game. Later, as Joseph was paying, Ray whispered, "They still don't have a clue, do they?" Joseph just smiled and left his usual generous tip. The hardest part was maintaining normal business relationships with Southview Bank. Several members of their investment group still had accounts there, and they had to act like nothing was changing. Mrs. Park still made her weekly deposits from her restaurants. Mr. Rodriguez still dealt with them for his construction business. Yesterday, Mr. Rodriguez told the group during one of their meetings, that same manager who turned you away was bragging about how well the bank was doing. If he only knew who he was really talking to. But they all understood the importance of keeping their secret. One slip, one wrong word to the wrong person, and their entire plan could unravel. They communicated through secure channels, used code words in public, and kept their excitement hidden behind professional smiles. The investment group now met in a small office they'd rented under a different company name. The walls were bare except for one large chart tracking their progress. One evening, as they gathered for their weekly update, Joseph stood before them with important news. "We've reached 40%, he announced quietly. The room remained silent, but eyes lit up around the table. They were getting closer. But success brought new challenges. As their ownership grew, so did the risk of discovery. The bank's management was starting to ask questions about the pattern of stock purchases. They hired investigators to track down the buyers, but the group had planned for this. Their stock purchases were hidden behind layers of legitimate business entities. Some shares were bought through retirement funds, others through investment trusts. Each transaction was legal, documented, and impossible to trace back to Joseph or his partners. One rainy Thursday, Joseph was having lunch with his son, now home from college. They sat in a small diner across from Southview Bank, watching people hurry in and out of the building. "How do you stay so patient, Dad?" his son asked, stirring his coffee. Knowing what they did to you, how they treat people, doesn't it make you want to just go in there and tell them what's coming? Joseph watched a young woman being turned away from the bank, clutching what looked like a business plan to her chest. Patience isn't about waiting, he said. It's about building something so strong they can't tear it down when they finally see it. That careful strategy was working. By spreading their purchases across different times and buyers, they'd avoided triggering any regulatory alerts that might have revealed their plan. The bank's leadership, confident in their position, continued their discriminatory practices even as their control slowly slipped away. Late one night, as Joseph updated their progress chart, he received a text from David, 45% and counting. They still don't know what's coming. Joseph looked out his office window at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in a fancy office, Southview's executives were probably sleeping soundly, never imagining that the man they humiliated was slowly becoming their boss. But this wasn't about revenge. Each percentage point they gained wasn't just about ownership, it was about the possibility of change. About creating a bank that would serve everyone, that would see potential where others saw risk, that would lift people up instead of pushing them down. As autumn deepened into winter, their ownership crept closer to the magic number, 51%. Joseph kept his warm leather journal close, reading the stories of all the people who'd been turned away, remembering why they started this journey. One evening, his wife found him sitting in his office, holding the journal. "We're almost there, aren't we?" she asked. He nodded, turning the pages filled with hopes and dreams denied. "Soon," he said, "very soon, we're going to rewrite every story in this book. And the best part? They'll never see it coming." Outside his window, the lights of Atlanta sparkled in the winter darkness. Inside Southview Bank, nothing appeared to have changed. The same marble floors gleamed, the same employees went about their business, the same managers made the same decisions. But change was coming, as silent and unstoppable as the changing of seasons, and when it finally arrived, it would transform not just a bank, but an entire community's future. The morning of the shareholders' meeting dawned clear and cold. Joseph stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his tie, the same one he'd worn the day Southview Bank had thrown him out. His wife came up behind him, smoothing down his collar. "Nervous?" she asked, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "Not nervous," he replied, picking up his father's old pocket watch from the dresser. "Just ready." The night before, they'd received the final confirmation. Their investment group owned 51.3% of Southview Bank's shares. Today, everything would change. But first, Joseph had one stop to make. He pulled into Ray's barbershop just as the sun was rising. Ray was already there, as he had been every morning for 30 years. "Got time for a quick trim?" Joseph asked. "Want to look my best today?" As Ray draped the barber's cape around him, he asked quietly, "Is it happening?" Joseph nodded. "We own the bank." Ray's hands paused for just a moment. "Never thought I'd live to see the day," he said, then got to work with his scissors. "Make sure you tell them Ray's barbershop sends its regards." By 9 o'clock, Joseph was parked across from Southview Bank, watching the other shareholders arrive in their expensive cars. None of them looked twice at him. Why would they? To them, he was just another face in the crowd, someone they'd never bothered to really see. His phone buzzed with messages from his partners. "Mrs. Park, our lawyers are ready. Mr. Rodriguez, everything's in place. David, all the paperwork is filed. It's time." Joseph took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. The same marble steps he'd descended in shame 3 years ago now led him to a very different destiny. The security guard, not the same one from that day, nodded politely as he entered. The shareholders' meeting was being held in the bank's main conference room. Joseph could see Richardson, the manager who'd thrown him out, standing at the front of the room with other executives, laughing about something. He took his seat quietly, just another face in the crowd of shareholders. The meeting began with the usual formalities: minutes from the last meeting, financial reports, projections for the coming year. Richardson was talking about their selective client strategy when Joseph's lawyer stood up. "Excuse me," she said clearly. "I believe we have some new business to discuss." Richardson looked annoyed at the interruption. "New business is scheduled for the end of the meeting." "I'm afraid this can't wait," she replied, opening her briefcase. "I represent a majority shareholder group that wishes to exercise its voting rights." The room went quiet. Richardson's smile froze. "I'm not aware of any majority shareholders," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. That's when Joseph stood up. He could see the moment Richardson recognized him, the flash of confusion, then disbelief, then the beginning of understanding. "Hello, Mr. Richardson," Joseph said calmly. "I believe last time we met, you said this bank reserves the right to choose its clients." He paused, letting the moment sink in. "Well, today the shareholders are choosing new management." The next hour was a blur of legal proceedings, votes, and paperwork. Everything had been prepared in advance. Their lawyers presented documentation of their majority ownership. The other shareholders, many of whom had been frustrated with the bank's declining performance, quickly fell in line. Richardson tried to protest, but the numbers didn't lie. The same rules and regulations that he'd used to exclude people now worked against him. By lunchtime, Joseph sat at the head of the conference table, the bank's new majority owner and chairman of the board. As the old executives filed out, some angry, some simply stunned, Joseph's partners began arriving. Mrs. Park, Mr. Rodriguez, and others who'd shared his vision walked into the bank not as unwanted customers, but as owners. One of the departing board members paused at the door. "How did you do it?" he asked. "How did we not see this coming?" Joseph thought about all the nights of planning, all the stories in his journal, all the people who'd believed in their vision. "You saw what you expected to see," he said simply. "And that was your biggest mistake." Later that afternoon, Joseph walked through the bank, now his bank. Employees whispered as he passed, trying to understand what had happened. He stopped at the information desk, the same one where he'd been turned away 3 years ago. "Excuse me," he said to the young woman behind the desk, not the same one from before. "I'd like to speak to someone about making some changes around here." She looked up, startled. "Sir?" He smiled. "Don't worry. These are going to be good changes. Changes that should have happened a long time ago." Back in his new office, Richardson's old office, Joseph pulled out his worn leather journal. He opened it to the first page, where he'd written down his experience from that first day. Then he picked up the phone and dialed home. "It's done," he told his wife. "How does it feel?" she asked. He looked out the window at Atlanta spreading out before him. "Like responsibility," he said. "Like possibility." That evening, as the sun set behind the city skyline, Joseph sat in the bank's lobby. The marble floors still gleamed, but they didn't feel cold anymore. They felt like a foundation, one that would support everyone who walked through those doors, not just a chosen few. His phone buzzed with a message from his son. "Proud of you, Dad." Joseph smiled, thinking about all the people who would walk through these doors tomorrow and the next day and the days after that. People with dreams, with plans, with potential. People who would no longer be judged by their appearance or their accent or their zip code. The security guard approached, looking uncertain. "Sir, we're closing for the day." Joseph stood up, straightening his tie. "Not closing," he said, "just getting started." The first morning as bank owner, Joseph arrived before sunrise. He sat in his new office, watching the city wake up through the large windows that had once belonged to Richardson. But unlike his predecessor, Joseph wasn't interested in looking down on people. He wanted to lift them up. As employees began arriving, he could feel their uncertainty. Change made people nervous, and rumors had already spread about the new ownership. Instead of staying in his office, Joseph walked through each department, introducing himself to everyone from the janitor to the senior loan officers. "I'm not here to clean house," he told them during an all-staff meeting in the main lobby. "I'm here to build something better, and I need your help to do it." He noticed some employees relax at these words, while others remained skeptical. That was okay. He hadn't expected to win everyone over in a day. Trust, like a good investment, took time to grow. His first major change came within the week. He converted the executive dining room into a training center where bank employees could learn about fair lending practices and cultural sensitivity. The old guard had complained about losing their private lunch spot, but Joseph stood firm. "We're not here to enjoy privileges," he told his management team. "We're here to create opportunities." The training wasn't just about diversity, it was about understanding people's stories. Joseph invited successful business owners who'd been rejected by banks to share their experiences. Mrs. Park talked about building her restaurant chain despite being told her business was too ethnic. Mr. Rodriguez shared how he'd grown his construction company through community support when banks wouldn't help. One morning, about a month into the changes, a young woman walked into the bank clutching a business plan. Joseph happened to be in the lobby and recognized the nervous excitement in her eyes. He'd worn that same look once. "Welcome to Southview," he said, approaching her. "How can we help you today?" She explained her dream of opening a small bakery. She had experience, a solid plan, and good credit, but 3 other banks had turned her down. Joseph listened, then personally walked her to one of their new loan officers. "Remember," he told the officer, loud enough for others to hear, "we don't just look at numbers, we look at potential." The woman got her loan. 6 months later, her bakery opened in a growing neighborhood. Joseph bought the first loaf of bread, and it became a weekly tradition. Every Monday morning, fresh bread from a business that almost never happened. But not everything went smoothly. Some longtime customers, used to their privileged treatment, took their business elsewhere. A few employees resigned rather than adapt to the new culture. The local business papers wrote skeptical articles about the bank's risky new direction. Joseph kept every critical article in his desk drawer, not out of bitterness, but as motivation. Sometimes, he told his wife over dinner, people mistake fairness for risk because they're so used to unfairness. The real changes happened quietly, one customer at a time. Like the elderly man who'd been banking with Southview for 40 years, but had never been inside the manager's office until Joseph invited him in for coffee. Or the young couple who thought they'd never qualify for a mortgage until one of the newly trained loan officers showed them how to make it work. Joseph's wife noticed he was sleeping better these days. "You're not up all night plotting anymore," she teased one morning. "Now I'm up all day building," he replied, kissing her goodbye as he headed to work. The building took many forms. They created special programs for first-time business owners, offering not just loans but mentorship and support. They partnered with local community colleges to provide financial literacy classes. They even opened small branches in neighborhoods other banks had abandoned. But perhaps the most significant change was in the bank's culture. Joseph made sure everyone understood that diversity wasn't just about hiring, it was about perspective. He brought in people from all walks of life to join the board of directors. The bank's leadership began to look more like the community it served. One day, about 6 months into the transformation, Joseph was walking through the lobby when he overheard a conversation. A loan officer was speaking with a young entrepreneur, going through his business plan with genuine interest and respect. The officer wasn't just following new policies, she genuinely cared about helping this person succeed. That evening, Joseph sat in his office looking at the bank's latest numbers. Despite the predictions of failure, they were growing. More importantly, they were growing the right way, by helping people grow. His phone buzzed with a message from Ray, his barber. "Just heard another success story from your bank. Keep it up, brother." Joseph smiled, thinking about how news traveled through the community. Every loan approved, every business launched, every home bought, they all created ripples of hope and possibility. Later that week, during a community banking event, one of the other bank presidents asked him, "Aren't you worried about taking too many risks with these new programs?" Joseph thought about the woman whose bakery was now employing 5 people, the couple who'd just moved into their first home, the student who'd gotten a loan to start a tech company. "The biggest risk," he replied, "is not believing in people's potential. And that's one risk we're not willing to take." As the sun set over Atlanta, casting long shadows through the bank's windows, Joseph walked through the lobby one last time before heading home. The marble floors still shone, but now they reflected something different. Not power or privilege, but possibility. A cleaning lady was mopping near the entrance. 3 years ago, she would have been invisible to the bank's leadership. Now she looked up and smiled. "Good night, Mr. Williams." "Good night, Mrs. Chen," he replied, knowing her name, knowing her story, knowing that her daughter had just gotten a student loan from the bank to study medicine. Outside, the city was settling into evening. Lights were coming on in offices and homes, each one representing a story, a dream, a possibility. And now, finally, there was a bank that saw those lights not as risks to be avoided, but as opportunities to be embraced. 5 years had passed since Joseph Williams walked into Southview Bank as its new owner. On this bright spring morning, he stood in front of the building, now surrounded by news cameras and a crowd of community members. They were there to celebrate the opening of Southview's 10th new branch, this one in a neighborhood that other banks had written off years ago. When we started this journey, Joseph told the gathered crowd, people said we were dreaming too big. They said a bank couldn't succeed by putting community first. Well, today I want to show you what happens when you believe in people's dreams. The bank's assets had indeed tripled, but the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the faces Joseph saw every day. The small business owners who'd gotten their first loans, the families who'd bought their first homes, the students who'd received education funding. Later that morning, he visited Ray's barbershop for his regular haircut. The shop had expanded, now taking up the whole building. A small plaque near the door read, "Funded by Southview Bank, Building Community Dreams." "Remember when you used to come in here plotting your takeover?" Ray asked, trimming Joseph's hair with the same care he'd shown for 30 years. Joseph smiled at the memory. "Now I come in here to hear how we're doing. You always know what's happening in the community before I do." And the community had flourished. The bakery owned by that first loan recipient had grown into a chain of 3 stores. Mr. Rodriguez's construction company had doubled in size, now employing dozens of local workers. Mrs. Park had opened a culinary school alongside her restaurants, training the next generation of entrepreneurs. Back at the bank, Joseph walked through the lobby, noticing how different it felt now. The marble floors were the same, but they'd added comfortable seating areas where loan officers could meet with customers in a more relaxed setting. The walls, once decorated with stern portraits of past bank presidents, now displayed artwork from local artists and photos of community success stories. A young loan officer stopped him near the entrance. "Mr. Williams, remember that couple I told you about? The food truck owners? They just qualified for their business expansion loan." Joseph remembered how this same loan officer had once been nervous about the bank's new approach. Now she was one of their most successful team members, known for her ability to see potential where others saw risk. That afternoon, he had a meeting with business students from the local university. Southview had become a case study in their finance courses, an example of how banking could be both profitable and socially responsible. The secret, he told the eager students, isn't just in the numbers. It's in understanding that behind every application, every business plan, every loan request, there's a human story. When you understand the story, you can see possibilities that spreadsheets might miss. One student raised her hand. "But what about risk management? Surely some of these loans must fail." Joseph appreciated the question. "Our default rate is actually lower than the industry average," he explained. "When people feel supported, when they know their bank believes in them, they work harder to succeed. And when they do face challenges, they come to us early because they trust us to help them find solutions." That evening, Joseph hosted a dinner at his home for the original investment group members. They'd gathered like this every year since taking over the bank, but this year felt special. Their 5-year plan had exceeded everyone's expectations. Mrs. Park brought her famous Korean dishes. Mr. Rodriguez came with his whole family, including his daughter who now worked as a financial analyst at the bank. David, the financial expert who'd helped them structure the takeover, brought charts showing their growth compared to other banks. "We did more than buy a bank," Joseph told them as they sat around his dining room table. "We changed what a bank could be." His wife squeezed his hand under the table, remembering all the late nights, all the risks, all the moments of doubt that had led to this. Later that night, after the guests had gone home, Joseph sat in his home office. He opened his old leather journal, the one where he'd written down all those stories of rejection and disappointment. But now he had a new journal next to it, filled with stories of success and transformation. His phone buzzed with a message from his son, now working at a bank in another city. "Dad, you won't believe this. The bank where I work is starting a community lending program." They said they were inspired by Southview's model. Joseph smiled, thinking about how change spreads, not like a tidal wave, but like ripples in a pond, one story at a time. The next morning, he arrived at the bank early, as he always did. The security guard, a young woman whose college education had been funded by one of their scholarship programs, greeted him warmly. In the lobby, he paused to watch as the first customers of the day began arriving. There was the retired teacher who'd invested her pension in their takeover, now helping her granddaughter open her first business account. There was the young tech entrepreneur whose startup had just hired its 20th employee. There was the former bank critic who'd become one of their strongest supporters after seeing the impact in his neighborhood. Joseph thought about that day years ago when he'd been escorted out of this same building. The anger he'd felt had transformed into something powerful, not a desire for revenge, but a vision of what could be possible when people believed in each other. As he walked to his office, he passed the wall where they displayed their community impact numbers. Thousands of new businesses funded, hundreds of homes financed, dozens of neighborhoods revitalized. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. The real story was in the dreams that had become reality, the barriers that had been broken, the lives that had been changed. It was in the legacy that would continue long after he was gone. A legacy built not on exclusion, but on possibility. And that, he realized, was the greatest success of all.